and we'll start with Representative Micah Caskey.
Thank you, Mr. Oh, there we go. All right, feels like a heavy moment.
It has to be green.
I get that. I mean, I know it's not green. There we go. There's green. Got green. Green for go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here today. Thank you for all of your input over the last few weeks and months, years really. I've done my best to hear and listen to the testimony before the committee. I've read almost all of the voluminous materials that have been submitted, the emails, the texts. I hear the voices in conversation. I hear the voices on the phone. I continue to listen and will, because this is a process, and I think that's an important point to note here today. This process is a process, and it will continue to proceed as it normally does. So I think anyone who goes out of here today and says that this is the final version does a grave disservice to our friends and neighbors across the state. And so I think it's important that we not take a snapshot and hold it up as a final product. I think we've seen that happen all too often. So I would encourage anyone here today to account for today's steps in a responsible and honest way, which is to say that we now have a working draft. Abortion goes to our very core. It reaches down to the roots of what we call the Western tradition. Where does life begin? What is it to be an individual? What are individual rights? And the answers we come to frame how we say we think about abortion. We find our answers in lived experience. We find it in our religious views. We find it in our jurisprudence, our cultural mores, our law, our national character, our personal moral codes, in our ethical frameworks, in everything. And I say that because, in a sense, I think that people here today and across the state remain closer than what might appear. And to be sure, I'm not suggesting in any way that we can find an answer that will make everyone happy. This is an issue which, no doubt, differences cannot necessarily be reconciled. It won't be. And I take the time to talk about this and to share my comments, Mr. Chairman, fellow committee members, because I have, to date, to my recollection, only talked about abortion at one point in a public setting, and that was just in questioning in full committee. But I think it's important for people to hear the process that at least I, as a member who represents a community, go through to try and answer the questions. And to that end, in my own analysis, there are really three ways to think about how we should frame an abortion. If you think about pregnancy on a linear temporal spectrum, we don't have anything to talk about preconception. The discussion begins at the moment that the sperm fertilizes the egg, and the discussion isn't for abortion after birth. So if you take that framework, you really have, again, three approaches to this. At first, you say at the moment of conception, the zygote is protected, and anything that would destroy that should be banned. I think a third approach says until the unborn is born, a mother can destroy the fetus at will. That leaves us, of course, with the second approach, and again, this is my own analysis and how I go about it. And I think my sense is at least that those of us who are within 3 standard deviations of the average American see those two ideologically pure attempts, in the first approach and the third approach, to fail to comport and to answer the questions because they don't incorporate the realities that we see in our lived existence. And they cruelly ignore too much pain and suffering in the pursuit of ideological purity. This leaves us again with that second approach that I talked about, wherein we try to draw lines somewhere on that spectrum. Some point before or after fertilization and before birth. I think that's where most thinking people find themselves, trying to balance the unbalanceable. For those who see the zygote in all of human embryonic and fetal development, at least predominantly as a bodily function of the mother, the questions are questions of autonomy, questions that put that line closer to the birth. After all, should a mother not decide what happens to her own body? Should she not at least have the nominal right to choose what happens inside her own womb? But for the woman, gestation is non-existent, after all. The unborn child, for most, is a precious gift whose fate, nonetheless, is the mother's to decide. It is a mother who makes the decision, or should make the decision, in the minds of those advocates with little interference from the government. And so our deep questions that we talked about earlier are thus answered by the pro-choice advocates by demanding a right to abortion. On the other end of our second approach, a framework, again, that I've created out of whole cloth, is where most of us find ourselves. In that approach, if you think that the human zygote is fundamentally different than other cells, as I do, if you think that that group of cells is special, and we use the word life for that, then you try to set the line closer to the beginning, closer to the emergence of life. To do this, we pro-lifers ultimately insist that these cells deserve to be treated like born human beings, and thus cannot have their lives ended summarily or without due process, to borrow a term from our legal lexicon. The abortion for the pro-life side of the debate is akin to an intentional homicide that the law, at minimum, should ban. And if the law prohibits the killing of another human being post-birth as a moral and ethical imperative, it must do so for the preborn human being. Complicating this complicated landscape are, of course, complications. Scientifically complicated complications, real-world complications, tragic and painful complications. Complications that must be addressed, for better or worse, in the cold and dispassionate hands of the law. As someone who is pro-life and as someone who listens, I believe this bill is an important first start at how we should address abortion in South Carolina. I appreciate the committee draft addressing my two principal concerns. First, that a mother's right to self-preservation is maintained, that we make explicitly clear, as Mr. McCravey indicated, that conditions such as ectopic pregnancies and others are addressed explicitly in our law. And we did that because we heard from members of the community who said they were worried that it wasn't clear enough. So we've done that. We've made it clear, and I appreciate the committee doing that. The second important step is that we protected in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization is an important, an amazing blessing of technology that we've been given. And it brings joy and life into fruition, which is something we should celebrate. And again, I appreciate the committee's effort to make sure that we don't jeopardize or risk jeopardizing that in any way. I do think there are some opportunities for improvement. I think we need to think more about fetal anomalies, because I, like many members, want to make sure that those who are disabled, physically challenged, are not executed in the womb. But we have to acknowledge realities about development that threaten or make clear that life is incompatible for that particular child. So I think we have an opportunity to do that. I think we need to do more to strengthen our abortion laws in South Carolina, our adoption laws. I think this is an opportunity that we should take advantage of to ensure that adoption is available for more South Carolinians. I'd like to see us do more to address prenatal, maternal, and postpartum care. I think this is an opportunity for South Carolina to say emphatically that we are pro-life and that we're going to do all that we can to support it, including mental health. So, again, and in conclusion, I appreciate your patience and your attention. This is a process. Today is an important step. It's a first step. And as we go forward, both in the House and then ultimately in the Senate and back in the House, back to the Senate, that you who have constructive input share that in a positive and useful way. We've done a lot here today to ensure that a mother's right to self-preservation is maintained, that IVF is protected, and that we're not going to criminalize women who ultimately seek abortions. So I thank you. I appreciate the time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.